away.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the launch of Open Secret's new investigative report, #Shutdowns everywhere you go. Thank you so much for joining us today. This report covers a range of serious allegations of MTN's conduct in the areas that it operates, ranging from allegations of corruption and tax evasion to its alleged facilitation of human rights violations in the context of conflict and elections. The report also goes into detail about looking at the barriers and potential pathways when trying to hold MTN and other transnational corporations to account. I'm joined today by the lead author, Abby May, investigator Raisa Patha, and lawyer Jane Borman. My name is Luvana Nduli, and I'll be hosting today's discussion. Please post your questions in the comments section. We'll be having a Q&A session later. I'm really excited to get into this chat with you guys today. Abby, let me turn to you first. And yeah, it's a brilliant report, if I do say so myself. I think it's really important. And I think the work that's been put together here is really telling of not only the work that Open Secrets does, but just a really important idea around what it is holding corporations to account. And so, Abby, I'd like to ask you, what is it about MTN and why is it that you chose to do this particular investigation? Especially in the context where there are other, global telecommunications companies that have engaged in similar conduct. What is it about MTN that is so specific to our South African context, as well as the global context and operates, and why did you choose to investigate it?
Thanks, Luvano. Firstly, just want to say thank you to everyone who is joining us online. Really happy that you're here for our discussion. So for those of you who have been following Open Secrets for quite a long while, you would know that we have, over the course of going on to 8 years now, have been exposing the human rights violations and corruption allegations against primarily private actors and private companies. And one of the hardest parts of our work is the fact that how exactly do you hold private companies accountable for these allegations against them? And how do you do that in a way that will actually provide justice for the vulnerable communities that have been harmed by their actions? And so one of the main reasons why we decided to do this investigation was to really grapple with this question of how exactly do you hold a private South African company accountable for its business conduct in countries outside of South Africa? And that's a really, really difficult question. The reason why we decided to focus on the telecommunications industry is because it provides such a complex and interesting space for us to tackle that question. So the telecommunications industry provides us with vital services that are absolutely intertwined with human rights, such as your right to free speech, being able to communicate freely, being able to access information. Within the report, we highlight that over 67% of the global population have access to the internet. And that is primarily through your cell phones. And private telecommunication companies are the ones that are providing these services, and they are absolutely intimately intertwined to human rights. And the question that the report is trying to raise by examining the conduct of MTN and other private telcos that we mentioned in the reports, like Vodacom, is to kind of engage with this question of how do you hold a company to account when it is complicit in human rights violations, right? This is a really, really difficult question to tackle. In the report, you will see throughout that we lay out in all our case studies that MTN, and we bring up another case study focused on Vodacom in the DRC, but MTN in its subsidiaries outside of South Africa have been involved in internet shutdowns and have faced allegations of corruption as well in different jurisdictions. And you will note that what they have done, their business conduct, is not illegal. And I think that's a very important aspect to highlight, because how do you hold a company to account when their business conduct is not considered illegal within domestic and international landscapes? And so we're really trying to advocate and bring forth that question and to tackle it through the business conduct of MTN.
Thanks, Abby. I think that was, such a great, outline and overview of the report. And I think you've highlighted such an important and topical issue, which is that, intersection between digital rights and human rights. And I think, looking at these nuances is really exemplified by looking at MTN's conduct, across the areas that it operates. And, MTN has operations in the Middle East and in Africa. And I think, I want to kind of turn to the Middle Eastern operations and really kind of get into the detail of, what human rights violations have looked like and what corruption has looked like in this context. And, Raisa, I'll turn to you in a moment, but I think just to kind of highlight that one of the case studies that is explored in this report is that of Iran. And Iran has a notorious reputation for human rights violations, especially at the hands of the state. And, looking back to 2009, when protesters were killed, hundreds of protesters were killed in demonstrations against fraudulent protest results, election results, pardon. And, also looking, not too long ago, the killing of Masa Amini in 2022 by the morality police for wearing improper hijab, and the mass demonstrations that sparked. And I think in both cases we can see the role of telecommunications companies and what they've played in that, whether it was in regards to shutting down the internet or handing over the private information of users. So Raisa, I just kind of want to turn to you if you can speak to that a bit more. When did MTN start operating in Iran, and the terms of that license, and what has it really, what has its role been in internet shutdowns and other, human rights violations in that context?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting story. I mean, it goes back almost 20 years ago. And, as my colleague Jane will talk about later, we're still hearing a lot about MTN's role in Iran. So essentially in 2003, the Iranian government advertised a tender for telecommunication services in Iran. And it was quite notable because it was the first time that a private telecom service provider would be given the opportunity to do business in Iran. It was a $30 billion contract over 15 years as well, so quite lucrative, right? And initially there were two bidders who were vying for this contract. The first was Turkcell, the Turkish telecom service provider, and then the second was South Africa's MTN, who we all know very well. Initially, it was Turkcell who won the bid provisionally in February 2004. But in a twist, at the end of 2005, the Iranian government handed the contract to MTN to sign. Now, Turkcell was completely outraged with this result, and very soon afterwards, they began to allege that MTN had bribed its way to the contract by bribing former South African ambassador Yusuf Saluji in 2007 with a 1 million rand house. They alleged that an MTN employee paid for this. And they also said that MTN had paid a bribe of over 2 million rand to Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Yavid Gorbancholi. None of this has been tested in court, so we don't know what is true. But MTN has denied all of these allegations. Turkcell also alleged that MTN had used or leveraged its political connections to secure defense equipment for Iran. But again, none of these allegations have been tested in court, as Jane will later talk about, so we don't know what's true. What we do know is that Turkcell is still fighting this case very vehemently in court in South Africa and in the US. I think that this case is particularly interesting because Iran was an ally of the anti-apartheid movement. And we spoke to activists who said, that they look to South Africa as an example of democracy and of what can happen after repression. And yet, as Duvano pointed out, we see that MTN has been involved in internet shutdowns. I mean, in the Mahsa Amini protests, Mahsa Amini, she was killed in detention. And this is a story that will kind of resonate with South Africans, where so many activists were killed in detention in apartheid. But now we see a company that has been this darling of South African democracy maybe enabling human rights violations in Iran and other countries, which we will talk about.
Thanks, Raisa. I think that contradiction is so stark and it's so clear when looking at this case, when we think about what it means to be a democracy versus an authoritarian regime and how corporations, the role that they play in both of those contexts. So I think you've really highlighted a very important point there. And you mentioned Jane, who can speak to some of those legal challenges and also, Turkcell's response to, these allegations. And Jane, I want to turn to you now if you can speak a bit more to that, because it's quite a complicated and interesting case.
Thanks, Duvano. Yeah, as Raisa said, I mean, one of the main allegations that Turkcell is making against MTN is bribery. And essentially, Turkcell has been on an almost 10-year quest to get some form of accountability in their eyes for what they see as the wrongful termination of their contract and the fact that MTN was replaced in that contract. Now, what that has looked like for them has been very interesting. They have taken both the Iranian government and MTN to forums around the world and unfortunately have been unsuccessful. Like Raisa mentioned, they haven't given up and they've now brought that legal fight to South Africa. And it's a very, very interesting case because essentially Turkcell is seeking damages for up to roughly 72 billion rand from MTN. And this is what they say was their revenue that they lost because they were unlawfully or wrongfully replaced in this contract. But it's not just interesting because it will be the first time that these bribery allegations can actually be tested in court or might actually be able to be tested in court. It's also interesting because this court case will really set a precedent for how South African courts choose to deal with transnational corporations like MTN that are accused of facilitating human rights abuses in conjunction with foreign governments. It is a very, very topical question, and it is something that hasn't really been addressed in that precise way before. So we are really watching that case.
Yeah, Jane, I think, we're sitting in anticipation and just, I think the outcome will be very telling. And we look forward to those updates. And, I think it's really interesting because obviously what we're looking at is, the Middle Eastern cases that really stand out. And, MTN not only has operations in the Middle East, but in Africa as well. And, Iran is its only remaining Middle Eastern operation. So, there's a quote from the report, which I find quite interesting from, former CEO Rob Shooter of MTN, who says that, the operating environment in the Middle East has become quite complex and appears to be complex for some time, kind of telling of MTN's approach and their kind of dynamic as, in the Middle East. And he goes on to say that the focus on the Pan-African markets was the right long-term decision for the group, which is very interesting because as we'll later find out, the operations of MTN and the way it's conducted itself across Africa is not so different to what has happened in the Middle East as well. And so, Abby, I want to turn to you here and speak a little bit more about, MTN's African operations and, maybe, you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation about, MTN leveraging some of these political connections that it has, and to support its business in African subsidiaries. So I don't know if you want to touch on this very briefly before we kind of launch into discussion about the other African case studies that we've looked at in the report.
Thanks, Silvano. Before I answer your question, I just want to address a comment that's been made in the chat by one of our viewers about distinguishing the MTN group from that of MTN South Africa. And I think that's a very, very important point for us to kind of clarify. So as Jane mentioned just now, the conduct that we're discussing within the report is being done by a multinational corporation, a transnational corporation. And so you have the MTN group, which is effectively the main brand branch of MTN. And then below them, they have a variety of subsidiaries that are essentially in control of the operational, technical management of different subsidiaries. And so later on in the discussion, we'll discuss how these different subsidiaries between the MTN group, MTN South Africa, which essentially manages this MTN Swaziland and MTN South Africa's operations. Then you have MTN Mauritius, which the MTN group has 100% shareholding into. And basically, MTN Mauritius then effectively has all the shares of the MTN subsidiaries that operate outside of South Africa and Swaziland. And I think that comment is very important for us to recognize, because it plays into the complication of how to actually track who's made the decisions in terms of how to go into these telecommunication license agreements with certain governments. Later on in the discussion, we'll talk a little bit about some of the allegations of tax evasion between MTN Nigeria and MTN Uganda. But that's a very important point. And so just wanted to acknowledge that. On your question regarding the shift of MTN basically, making the decision in 2020 to exit the Middle Eastern region, and MTN Irancell is now effectively the only Middle Eastern subsidiary that MTN is in charge of, and they're a minority shareholder there. And they've made that active decision to move over and just focus their entire branding and the marketing, and then of course the businesses towards their African subsidiaries. And I think what's really important to recognize is that how MTN acquired its license in early 2004 and onwards, right, in Iran, essentially saw, high profile South African business people, that had very close political affiliations with what would come to be, prominent South African government officials. And from there, being able to leverage those connections so that they were able to kind of get into the conversation of having, a chat about acquiring the Iranian telco license. And this practice of identifying a local associate within a country to help the private company or the private telco that's coming in to acquire a license, to kind of leverage the either political affiliations that the close associate might have with the political ruling class in that country. And then from there, hopefully be able to kind of get into a conversation of getting a telecom license with the government in charge. A good example of this, I would say, is the Vodacom case study. And so I just want to highlight that Open Secrets received vital information for our Vodacom case study. Vodacom operates in the DRC, and we received vital information for that case study by the Platform to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa from what remains the largest financial leaks in Africa. And so just want to recognize the contribution of that partner. But to come back, what we see in Vodacom DRC, right? So Vodafone, again, is the brand that operates with around the world. And then Vodacom DRC is a subsidiary that operates within the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what we saw there is essentially a prominent private businessman. His name was Aliou Kanté. And he was inspired by Laurent Kabila and essentially was like, okay, I wanted to start a telecommunication operation in DRC. And through that was able to build very close linkages to the political ruling class, which was the Kabila family at the time. And Vodacom got in contact with Aliou Kanté and was able to set up a subsidiary of Vodacom through his political connections. But not just that, the sister of Joseph Kabila was president of the DRC at the time. Jeanette Kabila was a minority shareholder within Vodacom DRC as well. And so what we see is this business conduct that is centered on pursuing contracts and license agreements that with government officials that might not have the best intentions, but also governments that are authoritarian in nature. And then from there, ensure that they get access to the market and in turn ensure that whatever local associate might have been involved in that transaction is given some kind of minority shareholding. Where it gets really complicated is if the minority shareholder or the local associate doesn't have the money to actually purchase their shares, right? It takes millions and millions of dollars or whatever currency you want to put in there to actually be a minority shareholder in any company's subsidiary. It takes a lot of money to get that starting capital. And so what often happens in the telecommunications industry is that the private telco will offer a loan to the potential minority shareholder. And sometimes it's really, really difficult to track whether that loan has been repaid. Raisa and Jane, who made inputs on Iran, you know, their case study basically like highlights that, and that's really important. So you see that. And then my last point on this is that sometimes those local associations with the political ruling class can result in internet shutdowns that come later down in the line because the government shareholders within the subsidiary, you know, have access to that, are able to like make that call, not only because of the contract that the telco signed before they entered the market, but also because they actually have financial stakes in the game of the subsidiary. Yeah.
Thanks, Abby. I think, you know, it is important to highlight, you know, that distinction between MTN South Africa and MTN Group. And like you've pointed out, it plays out in the way that, you know, telco companies operate. And, you know, like we've said, MTN is an example that we're looking at, but Vodacom and in other instances as well, this is, you know, the kind of terms of agreement with when it comes to licenses are often, you know, very much around what is happening in those company structures as well. You know, these things aren't, you know, don't operate in silo. And so I think that is, you know, really important to kind of take note of. And I think just to kind of turn to, you know, another case study that you kind of pointed to and looked at, and that we've looked at in this report, you know, Sudan and Cameroon are really great examples, or, you know, important examples of, you know, what internet shutdowns have looked like in the context of conflict, and what that has meant for people on the ground. And I think, you know, really asking the responsibility of, you know, those telco companies and MTN, what are their responsibilities, operating within the terms of their license agreement, even though, state power isn't necessarily as, clear cut and defined. And so, I think, let's discuss this a bit further, because I think, the ongoing war in Sudan, which has been, raging since 2023, is not the first instance in which we've seen internet shutdowns happen in Sudan. MTN Sudan started in 2005, and this was, during the Sudanese civil war as well. And I think it's so interesting to see how, the MTN has been complicit in shutting down the internet at various points during conflict in Sudan, not just, the war that is currently ongoing, but at different points in Sudan's history, and how it has not been held to account for this. And I think maybe you can kind of speak to this a bit more. But I know that, one of the, question that arises often is, what is the responsibility of MTN and other telecommunications company when they're being, ordered to shut down the internet? But I think it's also a very different conversation when, if a telco company is positioning itself as protecting human rights. It's a very contradictory kind of stance to take. So Abby, if you could speak a bit more to the Sudanese case, and also maybe to touch on Cameroon, because I think that's something that, many don't know about the role of MTN in Cameroon as well.
Your point of it being a very contradictory stance is really, really important. And to MTN's credit, they recognize that. So MTN releases transparency reports annually since 2020, where they basically break down, where a shutdown has occurred, where the government has asked for information on, certain communications that's happened between individuals because of a law case, or something of that nature, right? And in their transparency reporting, MTN has made it very clear that they understand that they are providing vital services linked to human rights. And, they say that they're very committed to respecting that and ensuring that they keep all of those things on. But in the same breath, they've also said that their contractual agreements with the governments that they are, governments are the primary customers that they engage with. A private telco company isn't able to access a telco license without a government regulation authority providing the actual information and contractual agreements for them to do so. And so they're tied up in this very, very difficult situation where they're operating in contexts like Sudan, where there has been war occurring for a very, very long time, where it is absolutely unclear as to who a telco like MTN's directives they're actually following. So MTN is the majority shareholder within MTN Sudan, and they've been operating there for a very, very long time. And what's interesting is that one of the minority shareholders within MTN Sudan, I believe this person's name is Abdelset Hamza, owns a company called Laricom. And Laricom, a couple of years ago, was placed on, US sanctions list because of alleged involvement in terrorist activities, financing terrorist activities, within different regions. And we reached out to MTN to ask, hey, is this person still involved in the business? What's happening? And MTN replied back to us and said that no, actually, no, they're not operating with us at all. They're not involved in the business at all. And that's because, Hamza was linked to these terrorist allegations and financing alleged terrorism activities. But the thing that's interesting about Hamza is that he was a very close associate of Omar al-Bashir, who was the dictator that ruled Sudan for a very, very long time before his overthrow, right, a couple of years ago. And the overthrow that occurred in Sudan went absolutely viral. The use of cell phones, social media accounts on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, images of people protesting not only the fall of Omar al-Bashir and the need for that, but then also protesting against what would come to be the military violence that came from that. And so what's currently happening in Sudan is that following, Omar al-Bashir, like basically like being like overthrown, two military factions have been fighting against each other. And I know that many people have been, reading and engaging with what's been happening in Sudan. But what's really, really interesting is that it's absolutely unclear to who MTN actually receives directives from. There's been reports that, telecom towers have been shut down by one group, the RSF, and there's been reports where shutdowns have occurred because the SAF, which currently is in charge of, primarily government services, has been like calling for internet shutdowns. And it's really difficult for MTN and telcos like them to even clarify that. And then on Cameroon, I'll just speak a little bit to this, is that Cameroon provides a very different contrast to Sudan, where it's absolutely unclear where, like Sudan, it's unclear where MTN is receiving their directives from to shut down the internet. In Cameroon, it is quite clear that it is the French-speaking government that's been ruled by Paul Biya for almost half his life. And I think that what's been happening in Cameroon has been labeled the Ambazonian War. And essentially, it affects the English-speaking regions of Cameroon in the northwest and southwest of Cameroon. And what's been happening there has been large amounts of protest against the French-speaking government. And they've utilized that, their ability to provide directives to MTN to be like, shut down the internet in these regions. And then from there, reports have been received about violence that's occurred from that. And, it just goes back to your point of it's really difficult to manage these things and how contradictory it is.
Thanks, Abby. I think that is a very interesting point. And, just for a second to look back at the Sudanese case, these licenses do expire, and there is, the question of renewal then comes up when MTN will have to renew its licenses in Sudan. And the question that you pose is a very important one of, if state power is being contested, if the regulatory authority does not exist in the form that it is supposed to, then where do these renewals applications go to? Who is then the kind of overseeing body in these instances? And I think that's a very important thing to keep an eye on. And yeah, I think just to very briefly before we break into the Q&A session, something you spoke a little bit about was tax evasion. I think sometimes tax evasion is what is most commonly associated with transnational corporations and their conduct and misconduct. And so issues around, human rights violations, internet shutdowns kind of get lost in the fold. But I think, MTN has also been implicated in, alleged tax evasion. And so I think if you could speak to this a little bit more, just to kind of clarify the levels at which this is occurring. And again, to your point about, the structure of MTN Group, South Africa, and the other companies involved. If you could speak to this very briefly, then we'll break for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please do pose them. We see them coming in, so we'll get to those very shortly.
It's super interesting what's the current global discussions that's happening within tax justice. Last week, there was meetings. I believe it was in Italy. Can correct me if I'm wrong, but the International Tax Justice Network have been advocating for a UN convention on basically tax justice, right? On ensuring that governments don't lose public revenue because of transnational companies evading their taxes. And what's really interesting is that the Tax Justice Network provided a report at the end of last year. I think it was published in November 2024. And in that, they basically detailed, how much revenue governments of different countries are actually losing because transnational companies are evading taxes by setting up subsidiaries in what's known as tax havens, right? So countries where you do not have to declare your tax, you do not have to, provide like receipts of whether you're even paying tax. And one of the most interesting statistics that came out of that is that they said that roughly about over $340 billion have been lost because of transnational corporations evading taxes and paying taxes. And they kind of registered that between, I think, it was 2023 and 2024. And what's interesting is that the case studies of MTN Nigeria and MTN Uganda provides a very clear, example of how this can take place. And so basically in 2015, a mass international investigation was conducted by various journalists around the world into MTN Mauritius. And like I said in the beginning of the stream, MTN Mauritius is the subsidiary of the MTN group that oversees and is in charge of all of its international subsidiaries, right? And essentially this investigation showed that MTN Nigeria was paying management fees. I think it was roughly like $2.5 billion of management fees to MTN to Dubai, which at the time only had 115 staff members. But what was very curious was that MTN Dubai would then basically take those management fees that were paid and pay it on to MTN Mauritius. And at the time of the investigation, MTN Mauritius had no staff. There was no one working in MTN Mauritius. It was basically just facilitating these financial transactions. And, similar activity was taking place in MTN Uganda as well, which brings in a different level of, questioning of how to actually hold transnational companies accountable for this, because tracking large scale financial transactions across different countries is very difficult. But then having to do that with transnational companies within their own structures is even harder. And so I guess the question really is how do you go about that? Yeah.
I think that dynamic is really difficult to navigate. And, Jane, I'll turn to you now to kind of speak to what Abby was speaking to now, just in terms of what these structures mean for barriers to accountability and, what we have seen playing out. And, what are there potential pathways? What are the barriers? What do those look like? And, all of these contexts are also different, and I think maybe you can kind of speak to the fact that there has been a lack of accountability in these different contexts and what we can kind of, look towards.
Thanks, Ivana. I mean, as everyone can kind of tell from all the questions and information that we've been providing, is the question of how to hold transnational corporations accountable is very complicated. And partly it is very complicated because their structures are very complicated. And I think what is really important about the MTN report is not just that it provides, it brings together the allegations against MTN, but it also provides a really illustrative example of allegations against transnational corporations for human rights abuses, and how difficult it is for those allegations to be heard and for there to be accountability. In the report, we looked at 3 broad barriers that we feel like prevent accountability. Obviously, there are more, but these ones that we kind of identified in the MTN case and felt they were applicable to transnational corporations in general. The first is the fact that there is no internationally binding law that regulates or specifically stipulates what businesses' responsibilities are in terms of human rights. What this means is that it's basically left up to a country-by-country situation. And as you can tell from the report, MTN operates in countries that do not have fantastic human rights track records. So the question has to be, if MTN, the headquarters of MTN Group in South Africa, sits in South Africa, but MTN subsidiaries operate in countries that don't have particularly strong human rights track records, what is the responsibility of MTN Group headquarters in South Africa in terms of managing that? So the fact that that is not clear in international law is a really big barrier. I think the second barrier, which has also been talked about, is the complex structure of these companies. MTN presents itself, MTN and other transnational corporations present themselves as a brand. However, in reality, there are a complex web of companies. MTN, as in its total, is made up of over 20 different companies. And with that, we see again and again, not just in the case of MTN, but transnational corporations in general, that can blur the lines of who can be held accountable for what actions. And transnational corporations can use that to shield their headquarters from the actions that are taken by some of their subsidiaries, even if those are in line with their policies. And the third one that we looked at, which again has been illustrated by what everybody has talked about, is the fact that transnational corporations have a huge amount of resources and a huge amount of influence. Transnational corporations these days, some can have a bigger economic size than a country's GDP. And with that enormous influence comes access, specifically to governments. And what you see time and time again, which is of great concern, is that transnational corporations use their access to influence the laws that are being created to regulate them. Now, again, that's not a specific allegation against MTN, that's just something we've seen broadly. And what we saw in Nigeria is that a civil society organization came out to say they were concerned about the close relationship between MTN and some Nigerian politicians and whether that would impact the ability of MTN Nigeria to be properly regulated. So those are 3 broad barriers that we've identified. And for us, looking forward, luckily there is a growing movement both politically and legally that recognizes the need for there to be universal, international, binding laws that regulate and clearly stipulate transnational corporations and corporations in general, their responsibilities in terms of business and human rights. So that is one of the things that South Africa has actually, been a huge proponent of this international binding treaty, which also brings into an interesting question around, if we are such a proponent of this treaty, is our government looking critically enough at some of its own transnational corporations that are headquartered here? So that is one of the pathways that we feel would, and many others feel would be a successful way or a first step to tackling some of these issues.
Thanks, Jane. I think, those 3 barriers are so, they're all different and they vary in their nature, but I think they speak very clearly to, what we are looking at, which is a systemic issue. And I think speaks very much to that, our mission and what we're trying to do is understand how to hold these corporates to account, especially in these complex kind of structures and situations. And I think, we'll turn to questions now, because similar questions have been raised about accountability and, I guess the very human and on the ground impact of the conduct of telecommunications companies and MTN. So I think I'd like to start with a question for Raisa. You haven't spoken in a while. a question from the floor is, how has MTN justified its involvement in internet shutdowns, and what has the response been from affected communities?
Yeah, so I mean, it's very interesting, right? We're talking about how shutdowns enable and possibly facilitate human rights violations. But the key thing underpinning this discussion, which is why the MTN court issues are so important, is that many of these shutdowns are in fact technically legal. So when MTN gets an instruction from the government to shut down the internet in Iran, there's nothing legally wrong with it because it is contractually binding. And I think this is a point that Skumbuzo made in the comments, asking, can telecom companies refuse to shut down the internet? Is this legally binding? And the thing is, like, yes, in their contracts, they often are instructed and they approve these instructions by government and they shut down the internet. I think what we're trying to say is, like, they don't have to. And even if it's technically legal in the letter of the law, there is an ethical and a moral way to do business. And there are these human rights considerations that we need to think about. So when the Mahsa Amini protests happen, I mean, the United Nations said, that at least 500 people had been killed by Iranian intelligence services. When the Green Movement protests happened, there was no official record of how many people were killed. That wasn't being measured, so we don't actually know. And it's not just the killings; it's the fact that people are disappeared. They're put into prisons. And I think, particularly in Iran, we also have to consider the US has placed economic sanctions on Iran since 1979. It means that youth unemployment in the country is currently at 20%. So actually, ordinary people need the internet to do business because they rely on Instagram and small businesses. So we don't think about these things, the fact that it affects and disrupts the ordinary day-to-day life, simple communication services, loved ones trying to reach each other, and then that human right of protesters to organize. And I think, I think it's an interesting question to follow. The way that people in Iran responded was they actually started to use satellite services. It's a little bit awkward because they use Starlink, which is linked to Elon Musk. But a lot of the technically advanced activists were trying to access wireless internet through Starlink to disrupt the shutdowns. And then also very early on, people were putting their phones in like freezers and fridges so they wouldn't be overheard by the government, because those phones are also weapons against them. They are listening devices. They are information booklets. So it's very interesting to see how activists have responded. And I think it's our duty as South Africans to hold MTN to account here.
I think that's such an important point you've made, Raisa. And also, the gaps that exist also then create room for people like Elon Musk and others to, also then fortify what, their power as well. And I think it becomes an inherently unequal structure, whichever way you look at it. So I think it is really, really important to think about, and, long-term especially. Abby, to you, a question has been posed. Has the South African Parliament held MTN accountable or summoned them to explain their conduct?
As far as I know, I'm unaware of whether MTN has been called by Parliament to provide a briefing on their business conduct in other jurisdictions. I'm unsure of that. But what we do know is that the Hawks conducted an investigation into the Iranian allegations, and it's quite interesting because MTN provided us with a response that, they were completely helpful with the investigation, and that the Hawks decided to not proceed with actual prosecution and things like that, despite the fact that they had raided offices in 2018, so MTN's offices in 2018. But the Hawks didn't respond to us as to, what the state of the investigation was. And then on the other case studies on Africa, I'm also unaware of whether Parliament has summoned MTN to provide actual, updates on this. All we do know is that MTN has conducted an independent investigation called the Hoffman Committee and the Hoffman Report and their Iran allegations. And that was entirely an independent process. It wasn't actually done by Parliament or through a legal court process.
Thanks, Abby. I think that's That's really important to note. Another question, Jane, that I'd like you to speak to from the floor. Could the speakers answer, or Jane, could you answer whether you think stricter due diligence requirements and laws in South Africa would go towards accountability, or is it just another tick box exercise for companies to hide behind accountability?
Thanks for that question. And I mean, that really is, we have to look at the difference between sort of formal due diligence, the ability for company to say exactly like you say, tick box exercises, and substantive due diligence, which would ensure that corporations had to consider their human rights impact, before undertaking operations in their supply chains, and would have that duty to remedy those human rights abuses if they did occur. It's hard to say. I mean, I think that it would depend on how the law was structured, and really what it would depend on is how there would be consequence management. What would it mean if a company didn't meet certain due diligence requirements? Because, as you can see around the world, for many companies, paying a small fine in economic terms for them is not such a big deal. So you would have to have consequences for corporations that were significant and meaningful, and that would allow them to, value people over profit, because corporations as they stand are profit-making entities, and the law would have to be substantial enough to sway corporations' decision-making and allow them to make decisions that would prioritize human rights in circumstances where they might as well otherwise have prioritized profit.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Abby, if I can turn back to you for another question. Keep them coming, guys. These are great questions. Abby, if I can turn to you. A question has been posed: what has the role been of local telecommunications where MTN has operated? So local telecommunications regulators in the shutdowns.
So this is actually quite interesting, because often the regulators themselves operate, on behalf of the government authorities in charge of the country. So what's really interesting is that in Sudan, for example, the telecommunications authority has, actively said like, hey, you need to shut down the internet. But again, it's unclear as to whether that directive is coming from the SAF, the RSF. We don't know who exactly is in charge, and who MTN is supposed to be held accountable to a certain degree. MTN has made it clear in Sudan that, they follow the regulators, but also Sudan is a very interesting case study. For example, in MTN Nigeria and MTN Uganda, regulators were very, very thorough into their investigations and the allegations of tax evasion, and have been pretty vocal on MTN, both of those MTN subsidiaries having to pay back the taxes that are owed. But we don't see as much of a thorough and purposeful pursuit of accountability when it comes to the actual internet shutdown aspects of what's taking place. And often that's because the regulators themselves are government officials that have to follow the government orders of the time. MTN Uganda, in their elections, I think it was between 2016 2018, Yoweri Museveni was basically a president candidate within the election, and he outright said to reporters at the time, like, we need to shut down the internet because reporters were publishing articles, against his, campaign. And the regulatory authority, the Uganda regulatory authority at the time, did not do anything about that. And so it really depends on the context, the country, and also what's politically hot at the time.
Thanks, Abby. I think a lot of these questions are really around, the issue of regulation, accountability, And, I think the report does a great job at, showing where these issues are and where the kind of barriers are. There's another question, which I think, Jane, you can speak to as well, from the floor, on the point about there being no global standards that outline the roles. Are you talking about the principles of business and human rights? Are you taking the principles of business and human rights into consideration? It seems to clearly outline the entity's role. Could you speak to that a bit, Jane? Thank you.
Yes, no, of course. And that's why I've been quite purposeful in saying binding laws. What we have at the moment, and this is not an accident, businesses have advocated for it, is that instead of having binding international laws, we have guiding principles for businesses. And even though these principles are what we call soft law, they're not purposeless. They don't, essentially what they advocate for is for businesses for these principles to guide businesses in their action. And there's no consequence management really if businesses don't adhere to these. You also have, for example, the Global Compact, which businesses can voluntarily join. So it's business driven as opposed to being driven by states who are clearly saying that we need to regulate these companies. And that's why binding international law treaty would be an important step, because these wouldn't just be guidelines or sort of, pacts that businesses can sign up to. I mean, interestingly enough, MTN lists the guiding principles as one of the key, documents that informs their business activity. And yet we see then that all of these allegations of their conduct stand in contrast to their stated aims. And because these aren't binding and because they don't address a lot of the issues that make it hard to hold transnational corporations accountable, even in domestic countries, it means that corporations can get away with having these espoused views of human rights consideration and signing up to these compacts, but aren't held accountable when they don't meet those standards. So we discuss the guiding principles in the report, but what we're really calling for is a binding international law, and specifically one that would address some of the reasons that transnational corporations are hard to hold accountable in domestic courts.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, I think that's not only comprehensive, but it speaks very clearly to the nature of, I guess, what accountability really means, and what the responsibility of businesses really are. And we'll take one more question. Unfortunately, we can't take all the questions in the chat, but I think this conversation has been so informative, and I think although this was the last question that we'll take today, I think it's important as we continue our advocacy around this to kind of think these really important points through. And Abby, I'll turn to you to answer this last question from the floor. Were you able to ascertain the independence of the regulators? Such a good question. That is, do they enjoy the security of tenure, which would protect them and enable them to say no to political influence?
No, we were not able to ascertain to what extent all the regulators in these different jurisdictions are able to operate independently. And Open Secrets is a part of the hashtag Keep It On coalition. And there are many civil society organizations and activists that are currently working within Iran, within Sudan, within Cameroon, Uganda, Nigeria, that are trying to answer that question, that are trying to actually engage with this idea of to what extent are the regulators able to be held to account themselves, but then also place the human rights of those who are affected by internet shutdowns above their need to maintain power. And so I guess that kind of answers the question, but also just for everyone who is able to go to the coalition and support all those organizations that are doing incredibly important work so that we're able to actually get that information.
Thank you, Abby. So we've come, to the end of our discussion, and if you can stay with us for about 5 more minutes, we'd really like to speak to all of the panelists to kind of share their like 1-minute reflections and, remarks, aspirations, recommendations, what we kind of want coming out of this report. And yeah, to speak to some of those key things, your takeaways, but also, your recommendations and how to take this work forward. So Raisa, I will start with you.
Thanks, Devano. I think my takeaway is exactly what I mentioned earlier, which is just that because something, we spoke about all these legal dilemmas, the fact that like in South Africa, we're struggling to find laws to hold MTN to account because it's a transnational corporation. And around the world, like Jane illustrated, courts have dismissed this case because they've said, we don't have the jurisdiction. It happened in Iran. And then in Iran, you have a situation where there's very little independence of the courts and the legal system. So will this case be heard fairly, And I think there's a duty to kind of say, like, listen, even if something is like technically legal, is it really right? And to stand up and kind of apply pressure, like we as South Africans can do this. And I think, like I said earlier, we have a duty to apply pressure, not just on MTN, but on all the telecommunication service providers who are operating and headquartered in the country to be like, no, you can't just shut down the internet because you make profit from it. And it's very clear that they do make profit and that they make big revenue. I mean, in Iran in 2023, they made $9 billion in revenue. We also talk about a case which we didn't talk about here in Afghanistan, where MTN abided by Taliban instructions to shut down the internet during a time of war and civil unrest. And in those cases, they made an extraordinary amount of money and were able to build up their business and become the biggest telecom service provider at one point. If they hadn't abided by the Taliban instructions, maybe they wouldn't still be in Afghanistan. Maybe they would have been kicked out or their business would have suffered. And the point is that, human rights and human lives matter more than profit. And we need to apply pressure so that companies always put that first. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Raisa. Jane, I'll turn to you now.
Thanks. I mean, I echo a lot of what Raisa says. I think that this report is, in a way, a bit of a provocation. MTN is a company we all know really well. It's, there's a tangibility to that, but it's not unique. MTN is just one of many transnational corporations that operate around the world that have these allegations against them. And I think for me, the question is, well, what next? And what the report really speaks to is that there needs to, in a lot of these countries, individuals are speaking out. Civil society groups are speaking out. And these actions or alleged actions are not going unnoticed. So we have to ask, well, then what is required for there to be some form of accountability? So I really see this report as an important document regarding MTN's alleged conduct, but also really posing the very difficult question of, well, what do we do about this? And unfortunately, I don't have all the answers, and I don't think that it is an easy fix. But it's something we can't ignore because transnational corporations are becoming more and more powerful. The line between public and private sphere is getting more and more blurred. So unless there are clear obligations on transnational corporations and corporations in general, we will consistently find ourselves in this situation.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. It is a provocation. Abby, I'll end off with you and then we'll close the session.
I'm going to speak for all the authors on the call that it was really difficult to grapple with the content of the report because, as Jane and Raisa have just said, like it really is difficult to say, like, okay, what is next? And in the report, we make recommendations that, investigate these allegations that have been made against MTN. MTN has stated to us that the Hawks, did do an investigation. Okay, cool. You did the investigation into the Iranian allegations. Then make that information public, like tell us to what extent the investigation went, provide that information, because I believe it's absolutely vital for the public's interest, but not just the South African public, but all of the victims that were affected by the Iranian government because of internet shutdowns. We also say that, the transparency reporting that MTN does needs to be far more clear, be specific, tell us which authority actually told you to shut down the internet, when, why you complied, and how exactly that impacted your profits, because that's a big aspect that's quite unclear in their transparency reporting. And then, I'm just going to end it on the point that, yes, telcos like MTN, like Vodacom, and all the rest are in a difficult position where they're providing services at a profit and to make a profit that are intimately intertwined with human rights. But our call to action to them is to make sure that human rights are placed ahead of those profits and to be transparent about the fact of how exactly they're doing that.
Thanks, Abby. And yeah, just to say to the panelists, I think you've all spoken very clearly to, not only the different cases and the nuances in what we've been discussing, but also, I guess, that call to action of, placing, human rights above profit, placing people above profit, and we go away from this questioning everything that we know and what we understand in the hope that, we will continue to place people above profit. Thank you to Abby, Jane, and Raisa, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. The report is available to download from our website, opensecrets.org.za. Thank you.